I'm standing in a grocery store right now with a very specific shopping list. This isn't my normal shopping list. This is my grandfather's shopping list from 1970. Exactly what he used to buy every week to feed his family of 4. Milk, bread, eggs, ground beef, chicken, rice, potatoes, vegetables, coffee, butter. Everything a normal working class family needed. And I'm going to buy exactly these items, the same quantities, the same types of products. And then I'm going to show you something that will probably make you angry. In 1970, my grandfather earned minimum wage, $1.60 per hour. And with 1 hour of work, 1 single hour, he could buy everything on this list, everything his family needed for several days. Today, federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour, and I'm going to show you what 1 hour of minimum wage buys you today, compared to what it bought in 1970. Let me start by telling you about my grandfather. He worked in a factory, basic manufacturing job, nothing special, no college degree, just showed up, did his work, went home. And with that job, working 40 hours a week at minimum wage, he supported a family of 4, owned a small house, owned a car, took a modest vacation once a year, sent my mom to college, not wealthy, not struggling, just normal middle-class life on minimum wage. Does that sound possible today? No, it's not. And I'm going to show you exactly why. Let me explain how I created this experiment. I researched what typical grocery prices were in 1970, using historical price data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, newspapers from that era, old receipts that collectors have preserved, academic studies on cost of living, and I created a realistic 1970 shopping basket. Then I went to a modern grocery store and bought those exact same items, same quantities, comparable quality, and documented every price. The results are shocking. Let's start with the 1970 basket. Here's what my grandfather could buy with about $20, which represented roughly 12 hours of minimum wage work in 1970. 1 gallon of milk, 65 cents, 1 loaf of bread, 24 cents, 1 dozen eggs, 60 cents, 2 pounds of ground beef, $1.38, 1 whole chicken, 79 cents, 5 pounds of potatoes, 59 cents, 1 pound of coffee, 75 cents, 1 pound of butter, 86 cents. Vegetables for the week, approximately $2. Other basics, rice, flour, sugar, approximately $3. Total, roughly $20 for a substantial weekly grocery supply for a family of 4 at minimum wage of $1.60 per hour. That's 12 and a half hours of work to buy a week's groceries. Now, let me show you what I paid for those exact same items today. 1 gallon of milk, $4.69, 1 loaf of bread, $3.49, 1 dozen eggs, $5.99, 2 pounds of ground beef, $14.98, 1 whole chicken, $11.49, 5 pounds of potatoes, $4.99, 1 pound of coffee, $8.99, 1 pound of butter, $6.49. Vegetables for the week, approximately $14. Other basics, approximately $12. Total, $119.11. At today's federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, that's 16.4 hours of work. But here's where it gets worse. That's just comparing work hours. Let's compare purchasing power. In 1970, 1 hour of minimum wage work, $1.60, could buy 2.5 gallons of milk, or 6.5 loaves of bread, or 2.5 dozen eggs, or about 1 pound of ground beef. 1 hour of work bought substantial food. Today, 1 hour of minimum wage, $7.25, buys you 1.5 gallons of milk, or 2 loaves of bread, or 1 dozen eggs, or half a pound of ground beef. This is where the economic structure fundamentally shifted. An hour of minimum wage labor in 1970 bought roughly 3 to 4 times more food than an hour of minimum wage labor today. The dollar amounts increased. $7.25 is higher than $1.60. But purchasing power collapsed. Now let me address what some people might be thinking. Minimum wage in 1970 wasn't actually $1.60 nationwide. That's the federal minimum. Some states were higher. Fair point. Let me adjust. Average minimum wage across states in 1970 was approximately $1.75 to $2. Let's use $2 to be generous. With $2 per hour, my grandfather could buy that $20 shopping basket in 10 hours of work. Today, even in states with higher minimum wage, let's say $15 per hour, which is only a few states and cities, that $119 basket still requires 8 hours of work. And you're getting the same amount of food. So even with the most generous comparison, modern minimum wage workers work nearly as many hours for the same groceries. In most of the country, where minimum wage is still $7 to $10, they work significantly more hours for the same food. Now let's talk about what this means beyond just groceries. My grandfather, working minimum wage full-time, 40 hours per week, 52 weeks per year, earned approximately $3,300 annually. And with that, let me tell you what he could afford. Housing. He rented a small 2-bedroom house. Rent was approximately $130 per month. That's $1,960 per year. That's 47% of his gross income, high by modern standards. But the house was adequate for a family of 4. A car. He bought a used car for about $2,500. Financed over 3 years, payment roughly $45 per month. That's $540 per year, about 16% of gross income. Food. As we calculated, about $1,000 per year for groceries, about 30% of income. Utilities and other essentials, approximately $500 per year. Healthcare was mostly covered by his employer. This was before healthcare costs exploded. Total essential expenses, approximately $3,600 per year. Wait, that's more than his $3,300 income? How did he manage? My grandmother worked part-time, brought in another $1,500 per year. Combined household income, $4,800. Combined, they covered essentials and had a small amount left for modest savings and occasional recreation. It was tight, but it worked. They raised 2 kids. Both went to college. One on scholarships, one at a very affordable state school. They eventually bought the house they were renting, paid it off over 20 years, retired with a small pension and Social Security. Modest but dignified life. Now let me show you the same calculation for today. Federal minimum wage, $7.25 per hour, 40 hours per week, 52 weeks per year. Annual gross income, $15,080. What can you afford with that today? Housing. Average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city, approximately $1,400 per month. That's $6,800 per year. That's 111% of gross income. Already impossible. Even a 1-bedroom apartment in a lower cost area, maybe $1,000 per month. That's $12,000 per year. That's 80% of gross income before any other expenses. A car. A used car today costs approximately $15,000 to $20,000. Financed over 5 years at 8% interest. Monthly payment approximately $350 to $400. That's $200 to $4,800 per year. About 28 to 32% of gross income. Food. As we showed, approximately $6,000 per year for groceries. That's 40% of gross income. Healthcare, if not provided by employer, individual health insurance. Approximately $400 to $600 per month with high deductibles. That's $4,800 to $7,200 per year. 32 to 48% of gross income. Just those 4 categories. Housing, car, food, healthcare. Even using the lowest estimates. $1,000 rent, $350 car, $500 food monthly, $400 health insurance. That's $2,250 per month. That's $27,000 per year. Minimum wage, gross income, $15,080. The math doesn't work at all. You'd need to earn nearly double minimum wage just to cover those 4 essentials, and we haven't included utilities, phone, internet, clothing, any debt, any savings, any recreation, anything. This is why you can't live on minimum wage today. It's not that people aren't working hard enough. It's not that they're budgeting poorly. It's that the economic structure changed. Here's what changed between 1970 and today. Minimum wage did not keep pace with productivity or cost of living. If minimum wage had kept pace with productivity growth since 1970, it would be approximately $24 to $26 per hour today. If it had kept pace with just inflation, maintaining 1970 purchasing power, it would be approximately $12 to $13 per hour. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. It hasn't increased since 2009, for 16 years. Meanwhile, costs continued rising. Housing costs increased dramatically. For structural reasons we've discussed in other videos: supply shortages, investor buying, zoning constraints. Healthcare costs exploded. The U.S. healthcare system became the most expensive in the developed world, with costs growing much faster than general inflation. Education costs skyrocketed. College that cost $1,000 per year in 1970 now costs $20,000 to $50,000 per year at many institutions. The economic equations that made a minimum wage middle-class life possible in 1970 was systematically dismantled over 50 years, not through one policy change, through hundreds of incremental decisions, allowing minimum wage to stagnate while costs rose, permitting housing to be financialized as an investment asset, allowing healthcare to operate as a profit-maximizing industry, allowing corporations to suppress wage growth through globalization and automation without corresponding benefits to workers. Each change seemed small in isolation. Collectively, they transformed the economy from one where minimum wage could support a basic middle-class life to one where minimum wage leaves you below poverty. Now, let me show you something else I tested. I took my grandfather's actual monthly budget from 1970. I have his old records. And I tried to live on that same budget, adjusted for inflation, for 1 month. If $130 rent in 1970 equals roughly $1,000, today adjusting for general inflation, Could I live on a proportionally adjusted 1970 budget today? The answer was no, completely impossible. Rent adjusted for inflation should be about $1,000. Actual rent for comparable housing, $1,800. Food adjusted for inflation should be about $650 monthly. Actual cost for same groceries, $100. Car payment adjusted for inflation should be about $350. Actual payment for comparable used car, $450. Healthcare adjusted for inflation should be about $150. Actual cost, $550 with high deductible. Utilities adjusted for inflation should be about $120. Actual cost with internet and phone required for modern life, $250. Even adjusting the 1970 budget for general inflation, the actual costs today are 50 to 100% higher than the inflation adjusted amounts. This is what people mean when they say official inflation numbers don't capture reality. The official consumer price index says prices roughly doubled since 1970. But essential costs like housing, healthcare, and education increased 300 to 500%. The weighted average hides the sectors that matter most to working people. It's time. This next reality is what economic models often miss. Economics textbooks will tell you that markets equilibrate, that if costs rise, wages rise to match, that workers will demand higher pay or employers won't find workers. But that assumes workers have bargaining power. In 1970, roughly 27% of workers were union members. Unions could collectively bargain for wages that match living costs. Today, about 10% of workers are unionized. Workers negotiate individually against corporations with massive information and power advantages. The equilibrium theory doesn't work when power is asymmetric. And power became increasingly asymmetric over 50 years. So what's the point of showing you all this? Why did I conduct this experiment? Because people need to understand this isn't about individual failure. If you're working full-time and can't afford basic living, it's not because you're doing something wrong, it's because the economic structure changed. What was possible on minimum wage in 1970 is mathematically impossible on minimum wage today. This is an opinion, it's arithmetic, and understanding this is important for several reasons. 1. It reframes the conversation about poverty and economic struggle. It's not individual moral failure, it's structural economic change. 2, it informs better policy thinking. If we want people to be able to support themselves working full-time, minimum wage needs to be substantially higher, or costs need to be substantially lower, or both. 3, it helps people make better personal decisions. If you understand the structure is broken, you stop blaming yourself. You can make rational choices, move to lower cost areas, pursue higher education or skills, build community support, whatever makes sense for your situation. 4, it provides basis for political advocacy, voting for policies that address wage stagnation, supporting candidates who prioritize cost of living, opposing policies that further tilt economic power toward capital and away from labor. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not saying 1970 was perfect. There were serious economic problems in the 1970s, stagflation, oil shocks. Unemployment was higher at various points. But for a minimum wage worker, the basic math of life worked better than it does today. That's not nostalgia, that's data. And we should be able to acknowledge that the economic structure functioned better for working class people in certain measurable ways in the past, without romanticizing everything about that era. So here's what I'm taking away from this experiment. My grandfather could buy a week's groceries with 1 hour of work. I need nearly 2 hours. He could afford a house, a car, and raise a family on minimum wage. I cannot. The economic structure changed, not because of natural forces, because of policy choices. Choices to let minimum wage stagnate. Choices to allow costs to rise unchecked in housing, healthcare, education. Choices to prioritize corporate profits over worker wages. These were choices. They can be different choices. That's the point. This isn't inevitable. This isn't natural economic law. This is the result of decisions. And decisions can change. If this experiment helped you understand how dramatically the economic opportunity structure shifted for working class people over the past 50 years, subscribe to Decoding the Economy. Because this is what we do. We show you, with data and real experiments, how the economic system actually functions. Not theory, reality. This is general historical analysis, not personal financial advice, but it's information that provides important context for understanding why economic life feels harder than it should, why your grandparents could do more with less, why the American dream feels out of reach. It's not you, it's the structure. And understanding that is the first step toward changing it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.